The handcuffs clicked shut in front of the entire school auditorium. A single dad, still in his work boots, whispered to his terrified daughter as teachers froze in stunned silence. "Stay brave, baby girl." Before we dive in, take a second to drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will take you somewhere even wilder. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. The gym smelled faintly of floor polish and paper programs, the kind of scent that clings to folding chairs and cheap stage curtains. Parents filled the rows, murmuring with pride as children straightened their ties and smoothed dresses, waiting for the annual spring recital to begin. At the back, near the double doors, Daniel Reeves stood quietly with his daughter Sophie. His work boots were still scuffed with grease from his morning shift, his hair unkempt from a day spent under the hood of a car. Sophie didn't notice. Her entire world was the violin case clutched to her chest, small fingers squeezing the handle until her knuckles went white. Tonight was her first solo, the one she had practiced in their cramped apartment after school until her bow hand blistered. Daniel bent to fix a loose strap on her shoe, his large hands moving with surprising gentleness. "You ready, kiddo?" he asked softly. Sophie nodded, though her lip trembled. "Mom would have been proud," he added, and for a moment the noise of the room faded, just a father and daughter cocooned in fragile courage. Then the doors banged open. Two uniformed officers entered with brisk, heavy steps. Their presence didn't match the room. This was a place for squeaky violins and nervous applause, not for badges and weapons. The chatter ebbed, heads turning, as the officers scanned the crowd, their eyes locked on Daniel. "Sir," one barked, voice clipped, rehearsed. "We need you to come with us." Sophie flinched, tightening her grip on her father's sleeve. Daniel straightened slowly, shoulders broad, but expression calm. His jaw flexed once, the only betrayal of the storm under his skin. "There must be some mistake," he said evenly. The officer stepped closer, one hand already brushing the cuffs at his belt. "Not here. Not now. You'll come with us." The principal faltered at the microphone, words dissolving into awkward silence. Parents leaned forward in their seats. A woman in pearls whispered, "What's going on?" While a man near the aisle muttered, "They've got the wrong guy." Whispers spread like wildfire. Daniel didn't resist. Instead, he crouched to Sophie's level, meeting her wide, tear-glossed eyes. His voice softened to a whisper only she could hear. "Don't be afraid. This isn't what it looks like." He brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, memorizing the feel of her small frame trembling under his hand. "Dad?" she whimpered, her voice breaking. "Look at me," he urged gently. "You're safe, no matter what." The cuffs clicked shut, cold steel against calloused skin. The sound sliced through the room, louder than any bow on string, louder than the audience's collective gasp. Sophie's violin bow slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the polished floor with a hollow echo that seemed to stretch forever. She reached for him, but a teacher pulled her back instinctively, murmuring something useless and hollow about it being okay. Daniel kept his gaze steady on her as the officers guided him forward, not rough but firm, as if determined to erase the possibility of protest. The path between the rows became an aisle of judgment, parents shrinking back in their seats, children craning their necks to see the spectacle. And in the third row, Eleanor Ward didn't move. She sat perfectly still, the tailored edge of her suit brushing against her knees, her eyes narrowed in quiet disbelief. Her mind reached back to heat and fire, to a night years ago when chaos reigned, and she had been pulled from the rubble by a man with the same eyes, the same jawline. She had never forgotten his face, though she had buried the memory beneath board meetings, mergers, and headlines. Now that face was in chains. Sophie cried out as her father was led toward the doors, her voice cracking against the sterile gym air. Daniel looked back once, a flicker of something unbroken in his eyes, before the doors closed behind him with a final merciless thud. The recital had not even begun, but the night was already a story no one would forget. And for Eleanor Ward, it was only the beginning. The moment the doors closed on Daniel Reeve, the room fractured into noise. Parents leaned toward each other, whispers breaking like glass against the silence Sophie's sobs left behind. A woman near the aisle clutched her pearls and hissed, "He must have been dangerous." Another man shook his head with a sigh that dripped with practiced pity. Single dad. Figures. Kids from homes like that always end up in trouble somehow. Their words floated like ash, careless and sharp, and landed exactly where Sophie sat on the floor, her small frame heaving. Her violin teacher rushed to her side, kneeling down, wrapping arms around the child who refused to be comforted. Sophie's face pressed into her teacher's blouse, her cries muffled but unrelenting. The violin case lay open beside her like an empty promise, the bow snapped from its fall, still vibrating faintly on the gym floor. Teachers conferred in hushed tones about calling someone, anyone, child services, relatives, maybe the police again. Sophie didn't hear them. Her world had shrunk to the echo of the cuffs snapping on her father's wrists. And Eleanor Ward remained still. Her posture was a portrait, spine straight, hands folded neatly over her crossed knees, as if she were attending yet another corporate gala rather than a school recital turned spectacle. To the room she appeared unshaken. To herself she was anything but. Her pulse slammed against her ribs with the desperate rhythm of someone trying to be heard through walls of silence. That face, those eyes. She had trained herself never to forget the details of moments that defined her life. And yet this one had been buried, hidden beneath years of boardroom ceilings and mirrored elevators. Until now. Kabul. The word itself tasted like smoke on her tongue, pulling her backward in time. She had been younger then, arrogant in her conviction that she could change the world through humanitarian work. The night the compound burned was supposed to have been routine, distribute supplies, log numbers, file reports. Instead, it became chaos. Gunfire, smoke choking the lungs, flames chewing through fragile walls. She remembered stumbling in the dark, heat pressing against her skin, her ankle twisted under debris. And then, hands, strong, soot-stained hands pulling her free. Her mind stitched the memory together as if watching a reel of film flicker back to life. A soldier, tall, his voice steady even while the world collapsed around them. "Stay low. Follow me." He had carried her when she couldn't move, shielding her with his own body as walls groaned and fell. His eyes had been the only clear thing in that smoke, unwavering, determined. She had memorized them without meaning to. Eyes that told her, "You are not going to die here." And now those same eyes, weathered by years and grief, were staring at his daughter as he was dragged away in handcuffs. Her throat tightened. "You saved me," she whispered. It was so faint, she wasn't sure if she had spoken aloud or only thought it. But the truth of it rang inside her, louder than any applause this hall would ever hold. The dissonance rattled her. The man who once carried her out of hellfire was being treated like a criminal in a suburban gymnasium. The man who risked everything for strangers was the same man being pitied, judged, and dismantled in front of a child who called him Dad. Eleanor's chest ached with a foreign weight, one she usually locked away behind balance sheets and quarterly reports. She couldn't take her eyes off Sophie. The girl's cries cut through the whispering like a blade, raw and honest. Eleanor recognized that sound, not the pitch, but the pain behind it. It was the sound of someone realizing the world was cruel enough to take the one person they needed most. She had made that sound herself once, long ago, when her own father had left her mother for the last time. She felt the memory press against her like a bruise she'd forgotten was still tender. The difference was, she had been left by choice. This girl was being left by force. The recital carried on in fragments. Children ushered on stage with trembling bows, parents clapping too loudly in a desperate attempt to erase what they'd just witnessed. But the air never recovered. Every note fell flat against the walls, unable to drown out the ghost of that arrest. Eleanor stayed seated, unmoved, as if rooted by an invisible thread to the memory and the man at the center of it. She told herself it wasn't her business. She was here as a patron, a donor, a face in the crowd. But deep inside, she knew the truth. It had just become her business, because fate had a cruel, uncanny way of circling back. The man who had once dragged her out of fire was now in a different kind of burning building, and she could not unsee it. The backstage room was a jumble of folding chairs, music stands, and half-drunk bottles of water left behind by nervous children. In the corner, Sophie sat on a chair far too big for her, her legs swinging just above the floor. Her small shoulders shook under the weight of silence. The tears had stopped, but not because the pain had lessened, because she had locked herself away somewhere deep, unreachable. Teachers hovered around her like anxious birds, voices pitched high with forced cheer. "It's all right, sweetheart, everything's fine," one said, though her own hands trembled as she reached for Sophie's arm. Another teacher leaned in and whispered, "We should call someone. Child services, maybe." The words made Sophie flinch. Her violin sat abandoned across her lap, the glossy wood smeared by the faint streak of her tears. Her fingers twitched against it, trembling like they wanted to cling to the only thing familiar in the chaos, but she wouldn't lift it, wouldn't play, wouldn't speak. She just stared at the floor, lips pressed tight. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she broke the silence. "There's no one," she said. The teachers glanced at each other, confused. Sophie's chin lifted, defiance flickering through the cracks of her fear. "Just Dad." The last word fractured as it left her mouth, her throat tightening around it until it came out broken, jagged. The room stilled. No one knew what to say. At the edge of the doorway, Eleanor Ward lingered. Parents who recognized her, sharp suits, magazine covers, the Fortune 100 queen with steel in her voice, cast sideways glances. Some murmured, wondering why a woman of her stature hadn't already left the spectacle behind. But Eleanor didn't move. She stayed, her heels silent against the worn linoleum, her expression unreadable. Inside her chest, however, something stirred she hadn't felt in years. She knew this silence. Not Sophie's exact silence, but the kind that came from being left, from realizing the people who promised to stay sometimes didn't. Loneliness had a sound, and she heard it now in every shaky breath the girl took. Slowly, she crossed the room, ignoring the teacher's uncertain looks. Without a word, she knelt in front of Sophie. No boardroom mask, no commanding authority, just a woman remembering her own childhood when no one bent down to meet her at eye level. She reached out, gently lifting the violin that sagged in Sophie's lap. Her fingers brushed the strings as if handling something sacred. Then, carefully, she placed it back into Sophie's arms, folding the child's hands over the wood. "Play for him," Eleanor said softly. Her voice wasn't commanding, wasn't coaxing, just steady. Sophie's watery eyes blinked up at her, wide and uncertain. "He's not here." The words cracked open, sharp with grief. Eleanor leaned closer. The scent of her perfume, clean and subtle, drifted between them, but her tone was stripped of everything polished, firm, kind, unshakable. "That's exactly why you should." The girl's lips trembled. For the first time since the arrest, her eyes shifted from the floor to the violin in her lap. The weight of it was too heavy, the silence too loud, but somewhere in the space between grief and memory, her fingers curled tighter around the instrument. Eleanor didn't press further. She simply stayed kneeling there, her presence a quiet anchor. The teachers looked on, uncertain, perhaps even scandalized that the CEO who belonged on magazine covers was kneeling on a dusty backstage floor. But Eleanor didn't care. The world could keep its whispers. In this moment, it wasn't about power or image. It was about a girl whose world had just collapsed, and the fragile hope that maybe music could hold it together for one more night. Sophie blinked again, tears clinging to her lashes, and whispered so quietly it was almost inaudible, "For Dad?" Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest, most human smile. "Yes," she said, "for him." The cell smelled of bleach and stale cigarettes, a scent that clung to the back of Daniel's throat as he sat on the narrow bench bolted to the wall. The fluorescent light above him buzzed like an angry insect, casting everything in a sickly glow that flattened shadows into nothing. Across the bars, the arresting officer scribbled half-hearted notes onto a clipboard, barely looking at him. "Identity theft, outstanding warrants. You're not fooling anyone," the officer muttered, his tone mechanical, as if he'd said the line 1,000 times before to men who looked just like Daniel, tired, worn, already presumed guilty. Daniel's eyes stayed steady, his voice low but even. "I didn't steal anything. I fixed cars. I mopped floors. That's all." The officer snorted without lifting his gaze. "Tell it to the judge." A heavy clang followed as he swung the cell door shut, the iron locking with finality. Daniel leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cool bars, breathing deep, trying to steady the storm inside him. All he could see was Sophie's face, wide eyes brimming with terror, her violin bow clattering to the floor as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. That image seared itself into him, sharper than any wound he'd ever carried. He had promised her, again and again, that she'd never feel abandoned the way he had, left behind by a father who disappeared without explanation. That vow had been the anchor of his life, and now, in one humiliating moment, it had been ripped away. He closed his eyes, gripping the bars until his knuckles whitened. Memories pressed in, her laughter when he carried her on his shoulders through the park, the way she'd fall asleep mid-song when he hummed to her at night, her tiny hand slipping into his calloused one on the walk to school. Promises lived in those moments, and now they felt broken, scattered like shards of glass he couldn't piece back together. Across town, in a very different kind of room, Eleanor Ward paced the length of her office. The glass walls framed a skyline littered with lights, but she didn't see the city. Her desk was littered with papers she never left lying around, files pulled hastily from drawers she hadn't opened in years, old records, old photos. She wasn't a woman given to nostalgia, yet here she was, searching. Her hands brushed over a faded photo tucked into a worn leather folder, a group shot from her NGO days overseas. Dust clung to the edges, but the memory was clear. The soldier with the steady eyes, soot streaked across his face, one hand gripping a rifle, the other gripping her arm, as he pulled her from a building collapsing in flame. The same eyes she had seen tonight across a school auditorium before the police led him away in cuffs. She paced faster, her heels striking the hardwood like punctuation marks to a question she couldn't answer. Why him? Why here? Why in chains? Her gaze dropped to a smaller object tucked away for years in the bottom of a drawer, a pair of dog tags she'd kept out of guilt more than gratitude. She turned them over in her hand, reading the name stamped into the metal. Reeve. Her pulse jumped. The scar on his right hand had been unmistakable, the same scar she remembered, the same scar she saw tonight. She gripped the tags tighter, her chest tightening with something she wasn't used to feeling, uncertainty. Eleanor Ward never doubted herself. She never second-guessed decisions, never let the past bleed into the present. But now the two lives, hers and his, seemed tethered by some invisible string she couldn't cut. Somewhere in the city, Daniel sat behind bars, forehead against cold iron, clutching a promise he feared he'd already broken. And somewhere else, Eleanor stood in a glass tower, clutching the proof that the man she once owed her life to was the same man no one in that cell block believed. The past and present pressed closer, and though neither of them knew what came next, both could feel the weight of it settling in, the kind of weight that changes everything. The cell was small, but inside Daniel's head the walls expanded into deserts. He closed his eyes and the hum of the fluorescent light dissolved into the whir of helicopter blades, the metallic taste of dust in his teeth. Sand, smoke, fire. They came at once, crashing like a wave that had been waiting years to rise. The air grew hot, acrid with the smell of burning fuel, and in the haze he could hear them again, civilians screaming, boots pounding the earth, the snap of gunfire splitting the night apart. He was back in the ambush, his unit scattered, shadows against flames. Men he knew by voice and laugh, falling into silence with no time for goodbyes. And through it all, a woman, blonde hair matted with ash, eyes wide but unbroken. He had pulled her from a corridor filling with smoke, her ankle twisted beneath falling debris. He remembered the weight of her body slung over his shoulder, the feel of his own knees buckling as he dragged her toward daylight that didn't look like salvation, only survival. Eleanor. He hadn't thought of her in years, not by name, not by face. He had buried that night like so many others, sealed it away where Sophie would never stumble into it. She didn't need to know that her father once carried blood on his boots and fire in his lungs. He wanted her world clean, school projects, bedtime stories, the clumsy notes of her violin filling their cramped apartment. He wanted her to believe life was softer than what he had lived. But the past was never clean. It was smoke-stained, jagged, and relentless. And now it had followed him into a holding cell, dragged out by strangers with clipboards and suspicion, branding him with words he didn't deserve. Identity theft, fraud, criminal. They said it like fact, like gospel, as if a uniform and a badge gave them truth. They didn't see the soldier. They didn't see the man who had once shielded strangers from bullets, who had walked into fire when instinct screamed to run. He clenched his fists, knuckles grinding against each other, nails digging crescents into his palms. He could feel the old fight in his bones, the one the military had carved into him, the refusal to bow, the refusal to surrender. But this wasn't a battlefield where courage was marked by how far you ran toward the danger. This was quieter, meaner. This was a system that had already decided he was less than he was. And Sophie, God, Sophie. The image of her face as the cuffs closed around his wrists burned hotter than any memory of fire. Her eyes had been wide with fear, but also confusion, as though she'd just discovered that even fathers could be dragged away. He pressed his forehead harder against the cool iron bars, willing them to steady him. He had promised her she would never feel abandoned, never taste the kind of emptiness that had hollowed him as a boy when his own father vanished without explanation. He had built his life around being the opposite of that man, reliable, present, the one person she could count on when the rest of the world fell apart. And now, for Sophie, he was just another man being led away. His chest tightened until he could barely breathe. He whispered into the emptiness of the cell, his voice rough, cracking. "I'm not what they think. I'm not." The words weren't for the guards outside or the judge who would eventually hear his case. They were for himself. A vow. A reminder. He was not defined by the weight of steel on his wrists or the shadows of accusations. He was still the man who carried people through fire, still the father who tucked his daughter in at night and hummed the same lullaby his mother once sang to him. He would not let Sophie lose him, not to war, not to lies, not to mistaken identity, not to anyone who looked at him and saw anything less than who he truly was. His fists loosened, the fight inside him shifting, not fading. If they wanted to drag his past into the present, they would. But they would also learn that his past was not shame. His past was survival. His past was fire, and he had walked through it once before. He could do it again. The precinct lobby smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax, the kind of scent that clung to bureaucracy like a second skin. Phones rang, papers shuffled, and officers in uniform leaned across the counter trading half-awake jokes about last night's game. The rhythm was ordinary, until the doors swung open with a force that cracked the air like a whip. Eleanor Ward walked in, a dark tailored coat cutting sharp lines against the pale morning light. Her heels struck the tile with a cadence that silenced conversation in mid-sentence. Every head lifted. They knew her face. They'd seen it on magazine covers, financial reports, television interviews where her voice sliced through panels of men twice her age and twice as certain of themselves. She was a woman who didn't enter a room so much as claim it. The desk sergeant, a thick-set man with a thinning hairline, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, can I help?" "I want to see Daniel Reeve," Eleanor said. Her tone wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of command. The sergeant stiffened. "That's not protocol. He's being held for—" "He's not a criminal," she cut in, sharp as glass. She leaned forward, her eyes locking on his with unnerving steadiness. "He's a decorated veteran. He saved my life overseas." The room stilled. The few officers within earshot shifted uneasily, suddenly aware this wasn't a typical exchange with an impatient spouse or a belligerent lawyer. This was Eleanor Ward, the woman whose name could make markets stutter, and she wasn't pleading, she was stating facts. The sergeant faltered. "Ma'am, with respect, I can't—" "You can," she interrupted. "And you will. Because if you don't, I'll make sure every reporter in this city knows that your precinct arrested a man who carried civilians out of a burning compound while your morning briefing was about parking violations." Her words landed like thunder. The sergeant opened his mouth, then closed it. Behind him, another officer quickly picked up a phone and muttered into it. A buzz of nervous energy rippled through the station. Down the corridor, Daniel sat on a bench inside his cell, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if it might answer questions he couldn't. The night had been long, every hour stretching into an accusation he couldn't fight. He had learned long ago how silence could crush a man. But then he heard it, heels striking the linoleum like a drumbeat, echoing closer. A voice, familiar yet almost impossible, carried down the hall. Daniel Reeve. He lifted his head slowly. At first he thought fatigue was playing tricks, but then he saw her, framed in the glow of the hallway light, Eleanor Ward. Her presence looked absurd against the rusted bars and peeling paint, like someone had painted color into a black and white world. For the first time since the arrest, something shifted in him. His shoulders straightened, his eyes softened, though disbelief lingered. "It's you," he said quietly. The words more exhale than statement. Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze steady, her chin lifted. She didn't look at the guards, she didn't look at the clipboard or the keys jangling from the officer's belt. She looked only at him. "And I don't forget debts," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Not ones like that." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, humming with recognition. The bars between them felt less like steel and more like irony. He had once pulled her through fire, carrying her weight as if it were nothing. Now she stood on the other side of a different kind of fire, prepared to carry his name out of the ashes. Daniel swallowed, his throat tight. Memories pressed in, smoke, sand, her terrified but unbroken eyes. He had buried them deep, but now they stared back at him across chipped paint and iron. He managed a dry smile that never reached his eyes. "Didn't think you'd remember." "I remember everything about that night," she replied, softer now, though the steel never left her tone. "Including the man who wouldn't let me die." Daniel let the words settle in the air between them. He wasn't sure what this meant, or what would come next, but for the first time in days, he didn't feel invisible. For the first time, someone saw him for who he was. Not a janitor, not a criminal, but the man who had once carried another human being through fire. And as Eleanor stood there, unyielding, he felt something unfamiliar creep into the cracks of his exhaustion. Hope. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual midday chaos, plastic trays clattering, kids trading snacks, laughter ricocheting off tiled walls. But Sophie sat untouched at the end of a table, her lunch unopened. The sandwich her father had made that morning was still wrapped neatly in wax paper, the apple untouched, the juice box sweating a cold ring onto the laminate surface. She stared at it blankly, as though it belonged to someone else. Friends drifted by, tried to tug her into conversation, but she didn't lift her head. Words stuck like stones in her throat. By recess, she slipped away from the noise altogether, retreating to the shadow under the bleachers where the world went quiet except for the scratch of her pencil on paper. Her sketchbook lay balanced on her knees, the pages smudged with graphite. She drew with furious, jagged strokes that didn't belong to a child her age. On the page her father stood with wrists bound in iron cuffs, shoulders slumped, but eyes steady. Next to him, her violin lay snapped in two, its strings curling like broken ribs. In the corner she drew herself, small, crying, invisible to the crowd of faceless onlookers. Each line pressed harder than the last, as though force alone could make the paper understand what her voice could not. A shadow fell across her, and a gentle voice followed. "Sophie?" Her teacher crouched down, careful not to crowd the space. The woman's face was kind, soft in the way adults try to be when they don't know how to mend what's been broken. She glanced at the drawing, her expression tightening before she masked it with a smile. "That's a powerful picture," she said quietly. Sophie kept her eyes on the page, pencil tapping against the paper. The teacher reached out but stopped short of touching her. "He'll be back, sweetheart. Your dad, he'll come back." Sophie's hand stilled. She finally looked up, and the words that left her mouth came with a kind of certainty no child should ever have. "No one comes back." Her voice cracked, not loud, but final, like a door closing. The teacher's chest ached at the sound, but there was nothing more to say. She stayed kneeling for a moment longer, then rose slowly, giving the girl space to retreat back into her sketchbook. Across the street, Eleanor Ward sat in her car, the engine off, the windows cracked just enough to let the spring air inside. She had no business being there. She knew it, felt it in the prick of her conscience, in the way passers-by gave her curious glances as they recognized her face. But she couldn't leave. Through the chain-link fence, she saw Sophie's small figure tucked under the bleachers, saw the way her shoulders hunched over her drawing as if trying to fold herself out of the world. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She saw more than a grieving child. She saw herself. Memories she rarely allowed to surface pressed against her ribs. A younger version of her, standing in a cold hallway while her father packed a suitcase. Her mother's silence sharp as a blade. The unspoken lesson that love was performance, that affection was earned, that being left behind was proof of failing. She had grown into steel because of it, built walls high enough that no one could see the fear beneath. And now, watching Sophie, she recognized that same defiance, the armor children build when they already know promises can break. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel, though the car wasn't running. Guilt gnawed at her. She had spent a lifetime telling herself that survival meant staying out of other people's storms. But this storm was different. This one had a face she knew. A man who once carried her through fire, a child who had inherited his courage and his silence. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She couldn't stand aside. Not this time. Because if she did, she knew the girl under the bleachers would grow into the same kind of woman Eleanor had become. Strong, yes, but hollow in places no one ever noticed. And Eleanor, for the first time in years, wasn't sure she could live with that. The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and old paper, as if the walls themselves had grown weary of holding other people's sins. Daniel sat at the defense table, hunched in a suit that wasn't his, shoulders stooped under the fluorescent light. Beside him, the public defender shuffled through files with the heavy-lidded detachment of a man whose calendar was already overfull. He didn't look at Daniel much, except to lean close once and mutter, "Keep quiet unless I tell you otherwise." The prosecutor's voice filled the room with practiced ease, every word smooth, every sentence sharpened to cut. "Identity theft," he declared, pacing before the jury box. "Fraud, unpaid debts spanning nearly a decade, all linked to Mr. Daniel Reeve." He tapped a stack of papers as if the weight alone was enough to crush doubt. A man who masquerades as a law-abiding citizen by day while living under the shadow of deceit. Daniel tried to speak. That debt isn't mine. The signatures, they're forged. My ID was stolen years ago while I was overseas. Objection, the prosecutor snapped. His tone clipped, certain. The judge raised a hand. Sustained. Mr. Reeve, you'll speak through your attorney. The public defender sighed, slouched lower, and made a half-hearted note on his pad. Daniel clenched his fists under the table. Every word out of his mouth felt flimsy, like a child protesting against thunder. The polished rhythm of accusation left no room for the halting truth of a man whose only crime was trying to survive quietly. He glanced at the benches where strangers sat watching, a handful of parents from Sophie's school, faces curious, judgmental. He thought of her, sitting at her desk somewhere, chewing her pencil, sketching furiously into her notebook. He had promised her he wouldn't leave, and here he was, fighting shadows that wore his name like a disguise. The prosecutor pressed forward. We ask the court to recognize not just the pattern of debt and deception, but the danger of allowing this individual continued freedom. If he can lie about who he is on paper, what else can he lie about? Daniel closed his eyes, the words pelting him like hail. He heard his own voice echoing back from the holding cell the night before. I'm not what they think. I'm not. But in here his words carried no weight. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The hinges squealed just enough to turn heads. Eleanor Ward entered, her presence slicing through the monotony of suits and stale air. She moved with purpose, her heels sharp against the tile, her tailored coat brushing against her calves. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Some recognized her, others only recognized power when it walked past them. She didn't pause. She walked straight to the front, past the gasps, past the judge's irritated glance. Your Honor, she said, her voice ringing clear, this proceeding cannot continue as it stands. I demand a recess. The judge stiffened. Ms. Ward, this isn't your case. Eleanor's gaze was steady, unblinking. It is if you're about to condemn an innocent man whose only crime was saving lives. The silence that followed was alive, humming with disbelief. A few jurors shifted in their seats. The prosecutor froze mid-step. His composure rattled for the first time. Murmurs spread like wildfire across the room. Saving lives? What did she mean? Daniel looked down, jaw tight, his pulse roaring in his ears. He hated this, being paraded, being defended like a child who couldn't stand on his own. He never wanted saving, not from pity, not from powerful strangers with voices sharper than his own. But when he lifted his eyes and saw Eleanor standing there, unwavering, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel in days. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to fight this alone. The auditorium felt too big for her. The lights burned brighter than they ever had during rehearsals, washing the stage in a heat that made Sophie's palms sweat. She clutched the violin in both hands as if it might slip away if she loosened her grip for even a moment. The whispers of the audience pressed at her ears, polite, curious, skeptical, a child playing her solo late, after a spectacle no one would soon forget. Her shoes squeaked faintly against the polished wood as she crossed to the center. She stopped at the lone microphone, knees trembling, and raised the violin to her shoulder. The hall stilled. She looked out across the blur of faces and for a fleeting instant wished her father were there, his steady nod waiting for her in the shadows of the back row. The absence cut deep, but then she remembered the words whispered backstage, Eleanor's voice like a lifeline. Play for him. Her bow met the string. The first note squeaked sharp, thin, and uneven. A few parents exchanged glances, some smiles curling in sympathy, others stiff in discomfort. Sophie's throat tightened, panic bubbling at the edges. Her fingers almost faltered. She closed her eyes, breathed in. The smell of rosin clung to the air, sharp and grounding. She tightened her grip, shifted her weight, and let the bow glide once more. This time, the note stretched smooth, fragile but true. Another followed, then another. each one weaving into the next, the melody still uncertain but alive. The sound filled the room like a whispered prayer, trembling, searching, but refusing to be silenced. Every stroke of the bow carried something more than music. It carried the image of her father's hand reaching for her hair as the police pulled him away, the sound of his voice saying, "Don't be afraid." It carried the ache of drawing him in chains in her sketchbook, the sting of telling her teacher that no one ever comes back. She poured it all into the strings, and slowly the melody grew steadier. Eleanor sat in the front row, her posture rigid, but her expression softening with every note. She held her phone in her lap, camera angled up at the stage, capturing each tremor, each triumph. She wasn't recording for herself, she was recording for Daniel, proof that his daughter, small and fierce, was stronger than the fear trying to drown her, proof that even in his absence she could lift something heavy and make it sing. By the second movement, the audience leaned forward. The squeaks had smoothed into a thin but persistent song. It wasn't polished, not perfect. No child's first solo ever was. But it was honest, raw. The sound of a girl clinging to the one piece of her world that hadn't broken. The melody rose, filling the rafters, echoing into corners where even the whispers couldn't reach. Parents who had muttered earlier now sat silent, some blinking away the weight that pressed against their chests. They didn't hear a child struggling through notes. They heard longing. They heard a plea. They heard love trying to survive in the shape of music. The final chord lingered longer than it should have, her bow trembling against the strings. When it ended, the silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverence. The kind of hush that falls after a truth has been spoken, even if no one dares name it aloud. Sophie lowered the violin, her chest rising and falling too fast. She bowed quickly, almost clumsily, and hurried off stage. But just before the curtain swallowed her, her lips curved, small, fleeting, but undeniable. A smile. In the front row, Eleanor exhaled, her recording still running, her hand trembling just slightly around the phone. She had seen power in countless forms, in contracts signed, in cities reshaped, in fortunes traded. But tonight, she saw it in the fragile notes of a little girl's violin. And she knew exactly who needed to hear it. The city outside Eleanor's apartment glittered with its usual arrogance, 1,000 windows reflecting a life of power she had mastered and conquered. Inside, the penthouse was silent, still as a museum, the kind of space curated for admiration, not for living. She sat at the edge of her sofa with a glass of red wine, its surface trembling faintly in her hand. She sipped, but the flavor meant nothing. It slid down her throat without weight, without warmth. On the coffee table, a small collection of photos lay scattered. She hadn't meant to take them out. They had been buried deep in an old drawer, pulled out tonight as if Sophie's music had pried open a part of her she had long since locked away. One frame showed her father, tall and rigid, his mouth set in a line that was never joy, only expectation. He had clapped at her piano recitals, not because he was moved, but because performance was proof his daughter was still useful to his name. Applause without affection. She knew the sound well. Another photo was of her mother, or rather, the absence of her, smiling in a way that didn't belong to the room she had been photographed in, smiling like she belonged elsewhere, and eventually she had gone. Eleanor barely remembered the day she left. She only remembered the silence afterward, a silence that hardened into something permanent inside her. She traced her finger along the glass of one frame, the reflection of her own face mingling with the sternness of the man she had once tried so hard to please. All the empires she had built since, the acquisitions, the titles, the wealth, were monuments to steel and solitude. Proof that she didn't need softness, didn't need applause from anyone but herself. Yet tonight, sitting alone with the memory of Sophie's trembling bow and fragile melody, she felt something shift, something crack. The image of the little girl under the stage lights wouldn't leave her. Sophie's small back straightening as she found her courage, her music filling the hall with something unpolished but undeniably true. Eleanor had recognized it immediately, though she hadn't wanted to. It was the sound of defiance against abandonment. It was the echo of her own childhood longing, a voice inside that had once whispered, "Please stay." And then Daniel's face. The man in chains, the man whose eyes she had first known through fire and smoke. He had carried her once when she couldn't carry herself, shielding her from a world intent on breaking. Tonight, he was the one being broken, dragged in front of strangers, accused of things that weren't his. She saw his jaw tighten, his silence swallow him whole, and she whispered into the empty air of her apartment, "You deserved better than chains." The words startled her, not because they weren't true, but because of how easily they left her mouth, how much they ached. She set the glass down and pressed her hands against her knees, grounding herself against a flood she hadn't invited. Why did this stranger's pain feel so close to her own? Why did Sophie's wide eyes under the stage lights remind her so much of her own reflection as a child, watching doors close that never opened again? She had spent decades mastering distance, building armor so polished no one saw through it. And yet in a matter of days this man and his daughter had found the crack in it. Her gaze drifted toward the city skyline. Towers of glass gleamed back at her, cold and triumphant. She had thought this was what power felt like, control, untouchable and complete. But power had never made her feel this exposed. Tonight, it wasn't the skyscrapers or the contracts that haunted her. It was the memory of music, fragile and unfinished, daring to exist in spite of fear. She leaned back, closing her eyes, and for the first time in years, admitted to herself what she had always known. She had built an empire, but somewhere along the way, she had lost the ability to be human inside it. And now, against her will, Daniel and Sophie were reminding her what that cost. The visiting room was painted a dull gray, the kind of color that erases the concept of time. A scratched metal table sat between two stiff chairs, and Daniel's hands, chained loosely in front of him, rested flat on the surface. He hadn't slept much. His stubble was darker, the shadows under his eyes deeper. When the door opened, he expected another officer, maybe the public defender, again with nothing useful to say. Instead, it was her, Eleanor Ward. Impeccable even here, though her coat was simpler than the one she had worn yesterday. Her hair pulled back as if to hide the fact that she had probably slept even less than he had. She carried a leather folder under one arm, papers neatly arranged inside. When she sat down across from him, her eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. "I found someone," she said without preamble. "One of the best criminal defense attorneys in the city. If anyone can dismantle the lies being thrown at you, it's him." She slid the folder across the table. "He's agreed to take your case. I'll cover the fees." Daniel stared at the folder but didn't touch it. He shook his head slowly, his mouth tightening. "Don't waste your resources on me." Her brow furrowed, her tone sharpening. "You're innocent." He leaned back in the chair, his chains clinking softly, and let out a long breath. His eyes dropped to the table, to the faded initials carved into its metal by others who had sat here before. "That doesn't matter to them," he said finally. "They don't see innocence. They see a man with no money, no influence, no power. A man already written off." "You're wrong," Eleanor pressed. "Evidence exists. The truth exists." Daniel's jaw clenched, his voice rising but breaking as he spoke. "And Sophie doesn't need me chasing shadows in court while she's left alone in the world, watching me fail. She doesn't need me fighting battles I can't win. She needs stability. She needs someone better than me." The last words cracked, the sound of them heavier than any chain on his wrists. For a moment he wasn't the soldier or the janitor or the man sitting stoic in a cell. He was just a father who had promised his little girl that she'd never be abandoned, now terrified that promise was dissolving in front of her eyes. Eleanor leaned forward, her hands pressing against the table, her eyes burning with something fiercer than sympathy. "You don't get to decide that," she said, each word deliberate. "You don't get to tell her who she should need. She already chose. She chose you. Not some stand-in, not some fantasy of stability. You." Daniel's breath caught. His gaze snapped to hers, startled by the force in her tone. For the first time since his arrest, something in him faltered. The wall of resignation he had been building cracked, and emotion flickered across his hardened features. Pain, guilt, love so fierce it frightened him. He swallowed hard, his throat thick. "She deserves better," he whispered. But it lacked conviction now, spoken more like a plea than a truth. Eleanor's voice softened, but the fire in it didn't dim. "She deserves her father. The man who fixes things, who carries weight others can't. The man who once carried me out of hell. That man." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint hum of the overhead light. Daniel looked away, eyes glistening, jaw working to hold back the emotion threatening to undo him. His hands tightened against the cool metal of the table, as though gripping it might keep him from unraveling completely. Eleanor didn't move, didn't blink. She simply let her words hang there, a truth she refused to let him escape. And for the first time, Daniel let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he thought. The apartment felt too quiet without him, the kind of quiet that didn't soothe but pressed in, heavy and mean. Sophie sat on the edge of the couch, legs swinging, her violin case propped up in the corner where her father usually set it after practice. She glanced at it, then away, as if even looking too long would remind her he wasn't there to tell her she'd done well. Her eyes drifted toward the corner of the living room where his old red toolbox sat. It was dented and faded, the kind of box that looked like it had stories hidden in the grooves of its metal. He used it for everything, fixing her broken desk lamp, tightening loose screws on their thrift store chairs, even mending the lock on the front door when money was too tight for a locksmith. To Sophie, that box was as much a part of him as his hands. She slid off the couch, her socks silent against the floor, and knelt beside it. The clasps creaked when she opened them, as if the box disapproved of being touched without him. Inside, the smell of old oil and steel rose up, sharp and familiar. Tools were stacked haphazardly, wrenches wrapped in rags, screws rattling in the bottom like coins. But under it all, tucked beneath a folded cloth, something else caught her eye. A notebook. It was worn, edges curled, the cover soft and cracked from years of handling. Her small hands trembled as she pulled it free. She expected car diagrams or repair notes, things she'd never understand, but when she opened it, her breath caught. There were sketches of cars, yes, neat pencil lines of engines and wheels, but woven between them were things she hadn't known about. Scribbled notes of melodies, tiny treble clefs dancing in the margins, words written in the slanted script she recognized from grocery lists and birthday cards. One page stopped her cold, a lullaby, notes carefully drawn, words by on lyrics scribbled faintly above them. At the top, in block letters, it read, "For Sophie." Her throat tightened, tears blurred the ink as she traced the words with her fingertip. She remembered nights when he hummed softly while she drifted to sleep, his voice low, steady, warm. She never knew he had written it down, saved it like something sacred. She turned more pages and found half-finished letters, words addressed to a woman she had only faint memories of, Rachel, her mother. The sentences trailed off, unfinished, some angry, some tender, most aching with the kind of love Sophie had only glimpsed in the way her dad looked at her sometimes, as if seeing her meant remembering and losing at the same time. The tears fell freely now. She pressed the notebook to her chest, holding it like armor, like proof. They called him a criminal, accused him of things he never did. But she knew better. This book was who he was, not the charges, not the chains. A man who fixed what was broken, who carried songs inside him, who never stopped loving even when the world tried to strip him bare. her small fists clenched around the cover. They didn't know him, not like she did. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her sleeve, determination cutting through the ache. Tomorrow, when she sat in that courtroom, surrounded by people who looked at her father and saw a thief, she would show them. She would bring this notebook. She would make them see the man who sketched lullabies, who wrote letters he never sent, who loved fiercely, even in silence. He wasn't what they said. He was more. He was hers. The boardroom was a fortress of glass and chrome, perched high above the city, like a throne room where numbers mattered more than people. Around the long table, investors sat with tablets glowing and pens poised, their expressions a mixture of impatience and calculation. At the head, Eleanor Ward stood, her coat draped across the back of her chair, her palms flat against the polished wood. The photographs lay scattered in front of them. Grainy shots of her walking into the precinct, of her speaking to Daniel through the bars, of her leaving with her chin lifted, eyes sharp. Tabloid headlines screamed from the margins. CEO visits jailbird, billionaire's soft spot for criminal custodian. Greg Stanton, her PR chief, leaned forward, his voice low and sharp like the hiss of a blade. This is reckless, Eleanor. Investors are already spooked. The stock dipped 2 points this morning. You've worked decades for this position, for this empire, and now you're risking it for what? For him? A board member across the table tapped the photo with a manicured nail. Optics, Ms. Ward. That's what this is, a dangerous narrative. It makes you look sentimental, weak. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she didn't look down. She scanned their faces, men and women who had praised her ruthlessness for years, who had trusted her judgment when it made them richer, and now sat squirming at the thought of her choosing something unprofitable. Greg's voice grew colder. Step away now, or risk everything. She straightened, her spine like a drawn bowstring. What good is everything? She asked, her voice carrying through the room. If I let a man who saved my life rot in silence. The words hung in the air, heavier than any earnings report, sharper than any quarterly projection. Greg scoffed. Don't romanticize this. He's no one, a janitor, a liability with a record. The sound that followed was not the measured click of her heels, not the cool composure they expected. It was the slam of her hand against the table, the crack echoing against the glass walls. Every head snapped up. Eleanor's eyes blazed. He's someone's father. Silence swallowed the room. The board shifted uncomfortably, investors avoiding her gaze, Greg's face paling with a frustration he tried to mask as control. No one spoke. They weren't used to seeing her like this, not detached, not calculated, but raw, human, furious in defense of something they couldn't quantify on a balance sheet. She let the silence stretch. For once, she didn't care about filling it with strategy. She wanted them to feel the weight of what she had just said, the kind of truth that didn't need a graph to validate it. Her chest rose and fell steadily as she finally drew her hand back. She didn't lower her gaze. If your concern is image, then hear me clearly. I will not apologize for seeing value where you see risk. I will not step away from a man who once carried me out of fire simply because it doesn't align with your portfolios. If that costs me, then so be it. The room held still. Even Greg, for all his polished spin, had no immediate reply. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt unchained. The boardroom that had always demanded her armor, her calculation, her flawless control, now felt smaller, weaker. She realized she had been playing their game so long she had almost forgotten she could walk away from the table entirely. She gathered the photos, stacked them neatly, and slid them back across the table. Do what you have to do, she said, but don't mistake silence for surrender. Not this time. As she turned and walked out, the city stretched wide before her through the glass walls. For once, the towers below didn't look like proof of victory. They looked like cages, and she finally felt free. The courtroom buzzed with the kind of tension that clings to every surface. Whispers slipping between benches, papers shuffling with impatience, the bailiff's footsteps echoing like punctuation marks. Daniel sat stiffly at the defense table, hands folded so tightly together his knuckles turned pale. He wore the same borrowed suit, the tie slightly askew. His new lawyer, sharp-eyed and relentless, had spent the last hour presenting records pieced together like fragments of a long-buried truth. It was all there in black and white. Deployment logs confirming Daniel had been overseas when the fraudulent accounts were opened, copies of IDs linked to names that weren't his, dates that didn't match. A trail of debt, forged signatures, warrants, all tied to a ghost who had stolen Daniel's identity while he was thousands of miles away, carrying out orders under a foreign sun. The lawyer's voice carried with precision. This man, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeve, was in uniform serving his country when these so-called crimes occurred. The real thief has never faced this court, but you're prepared to condemn the wrong man because it's easier than admitting your system failed him. The words struck, but doubt still lingered. The prosecutor countered with questions about delayed reports, missing paperwork, years of silence. If Mr. Reeve is so innocent, he pressed, why did he not fight this sooner? His gaze cut toward Daniel, a blade honed by cynicism. Daniel shifted, ready to speak, but the lawyer's hand pressed lightly against his arm, a signal to stay quiet. Still, the silence weighed heavy. To the court, it might look like resignation. To Daniel, it felt like being buried alive while people debated whether or not to believe in air. Then, from the back row, a small figure stood. Sophie. Her knees knocked together as she walked forward, clutching the worn notebook against her chest like it was armor. The bailiff started to intercept, but the judge raised a hand, curious. The room stilled, the murmur dying into expectant hush. Sophie stopped just short of the bench, her chin trembling but lifted. She held the notebook out, both hands shaking. Her voice cracked on the first word, but she forced it through. This is my dad. The prosecutor frowned. Miss? She pressed on, louder now. This is my dad. He fixes things. He sings to me when I can't sleep. Her small voice wavered, then steadied, carrying across the room with a sincerity no polished statement could rival. She opened the notebook, flipping through pages smudged with oil and pencil, showing sketches of cars, half-written lullabies, unfinished letters never sent. He didn't steal, she said, her voice breaking into something fierce. He builds. The words cracked open something in the room. The jury leaned forward, some blinking, as if they'd forgotten how young she was. A few parents in the gallery lowered their eyes, shame flickering across their faces. Even the prosecutor's mouth tightened, his polished argument suddenly sounding hollow in the wake of her raw truth. The judge shifted in his chair, clearing his throat once, then again, as though something in his chest had caught. His gaze lingered on the child standing before him, a notebook heavier than any exhibit in the trial. For a moment, the gavel, the statutes, the rigid procedures, all of it seemed secondary to the simple clarity of her words. Daniel's vision blurred, but he didn't lower his head this time. He watched his daughter, small and unshaken, carrying his name into a place where he had felt stripped of it. Pride and ache, tangled in his chest, so fierce it was almost unbearable. The silence after Sophie's declaration stretched long and deep. Not awkward, not hesitant, reverent. The kind of silence that belongs to truth so undeniable, no one dares break them. The gavel came down with a final crack, sharp enough to slice the air in two. The judge's voice followed, low but firm, echoing against the wood-paneled walls. The charges are dismissed. Mr. Reeve, you are free to go. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. The words hung in the air like something too fragile to trust, like smoke that might vanish if he reached for it. The hum of the courtroom swelled around him, reporters fumbling for recorders, cameras clicking like insects, spectators shifting in their seats, but all of it blurred at the edges. The only sound he heard clearly was the faint rustle of pages as Sophie clutched the notebook tighter against her chest. Then he stood. The chain that had tethered him to his chair clinked once, then fell silent as the bailiff removed it. His steps were unsteady at first, but each one grew stronger as he crossed the room. Sophie had already broken free of the teacher who tried to hold her back. Her sneakers squeaked across the floor, pigtails bouncing, face shining with tears, and something brighter, certainty. She collided with him, arms flinging tight around his waist, the notebook pressed hard between them like proof of everything she had fought to show. Daniel dropped to his knees, arms wrapping her small frame as though he could fold her into himself and never let go. His chest shook against her hair. He breathed her in, the scent of crayons and dust and the faintest trace of her shampoo, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air filled his lungs without resistance. "I told you," she whispered into his collar, voice muffled but sure. "Told you you'd come back." Daniel pulled back just enough to look at her, his rough hands cupping her cheeks. His eyes glistened, not with weakness, but with something too long denied. "You kept me alive," he murmured. "Even when I wanted to give up, you didn't let me." The reporters surged closer, calling questions, shouting names, their words jumbled into a wave of noise. None of it mattered. Daniel bent his head to kiss the top of Sophie's hair, holding her like the rest of the world could collapse, and he would still be anchored here, in this moment, with her. From the gallery, Eleanor watched. She sat straighter than usual, not the commanding force she had been in the boardroom or the courtroom yesterday, but quiet, still. Her eyes shimmered, though no one around her dared to remark on it. For once, she wasn't the center of the story. She wasn't the headline, the executive, the woman whose name moved markets. She was simply a witness to love, raw and unadorned. She had thought she understood power. She had lived her life building it, wielding it, measuring its worth in numbers and signatures. But this reunion of father and daughter, this trembling, tear-soaked vindication, was something she couldn't quantify. It was beyond profit, beyond loss. It was the kind of power that heals. Daniel stood at last, Sophie's small hand wrapped firmly in his. He turned to face the court, not with triumph, but with quiet dignity, his shoulders straight, his jaw set, as if daring anyone to try and take this from him again. The notebook was still pressed between Sophie's hands, pages worn, evidence of a truth no prosecutor could erase. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice was softer now. "Mr. Reeve, you are dismissed." Daniel gave a single nod, not to the judge but to his daughter, then guided her gently toward the exit. The crowd parted around them, reporters lunging with microphones, cameras flashing, but their bubble held. Father and daughter. Nothing else mattered. Eleanor rose slowly, her hand brushing her cheek as if to catch a tear before anyone else could see it. She didn't follow right away. She let them have the center, as they should. For years she had lived as though the world revolved around her decisions. But in this moment, she knew with a certainty that shook her. Real stories didn't belong to her. They belonged to people like Daniel and Sophie, who carried each other through fire and chains and walked out whole. And as the doors swung shut behind them, Eleanor felt something in her own chest break open. Not loss, not envy. Something closer to awe. The courthouse steps were alive with noise, reporters shouting over one another, cameras flashing like lightning against the afternoon sky, microphones thrust forward in a desperate attempt to snatch a quote. Daniel shielded Sophie with his arm as they pushed through the chaos, her small hand gripping his shirt like it was the only steady thing in the storm. He kept his head down, jaw tight, determined to get her to the car waiting at the curb. Freedom was still new, fragile, and he didn't trust the world not to snatch it back. And then Eleanor stepped into his path. She wasn't flanked by aides or hidden behind dark glasses like the others. She stood simply, her tailored coat catching the wind, her presence enough to make the crowd hesitate. The reporters lowered their questions to whispers. Cameras tilted but didn't flash. For a moment it was just her, him, and the girl who clung to him. "Come work with me," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't a request. It wasn't even a pitch. It was steady, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. I already have a job. Not as staff, she countered, her eyes holding his without flinching. As a partner. I need someone who knows what's real, not polished. He let out a dry laugh, though it carried no humor. I fix engines. Mop floors. I'm not a suit. Whatever world you live in, I don't belong there. Eleanor's mouth curved, not into her usual sharp smile, but something smaller, almost tender. Good, she said. We have enough suits. We don't have enough men like you. The words hung in the air, startling him more than any accusation the prosecutor had hurled. For years, he had worn invisibility like armor. It kept people from looking too close, from asking questions he didn't want to answer. And now here was Eleanor Ward, woman of empires, a name bigger than skyscrapers, standing in front of him and insisting she saw him. He opened his mouth to argue, but Sophie tugged at his sleeve. Her eyes, wide and still swollen from tears, looked up at him with a conviction that stole his breath. "Dad," she said softly, "maybe it's time to fix something bigger." Her words pierced him more deeply than Eleanor's could. He stared at his daughter, the notebook still clutched in her other hand, the one she had carried into that courtroom like a shield. She had believed in him when he didn't. She had stood in front of strangers and declared who he was, and now she was asking him to believe it too. He looked back at Eleanor. She didn't press, didn't move closer, didn't offer more. She simply waited, her gaze steady, her presence like a hand extended across a line he wasn't sure he could cross. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of the years he'd spent bent over grease-stained engines, pushing a mop through silent halls, the weight of survival pressing harder than purpose. He thought of the war, of the fire, of carrying Eleanor through smoke when all he wanted was to collapse. And he thought of Sophie, her small voice in that courtroom saying, "He builds." His hands flexed at his sides. "I don't know if I can be what you're asking," he admitted, voice rough. Eleanor tilted her head, her expression softening. "You already are," she said. The crowd behind them surged again, questions rising, cameras flashing, the noise of the world pressing in. But for a single heartbeat, none of it mattered. On the courthouse steps, surrounded by chaos, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, not as a threat, but as an opening. Sophie squeezed his hand. Eleanor waited. And Daniel, for the first time in years, wondered if maybe fixing what was broken could mean more than engines and floors. Maybe it could mean people. Maybe it could mean himself. The hum of the community center was different from the courthouse, softer, threaded with laughter, and the clatter of tools instead of whispers and accusations. The room smelled of rubber tires and machine oil, sunlight streaming through wide windows that had been washed for the first time in years. Workbenches lined the walls, covered in wrenches and sockets, mismatched bolts sorted into jars that once held jam. Daniel stood at the center, sleeves rolled up, hands dark with grease, as he tightened the chain on a rusted blue bicycle. Around him, a half-dozen kids leaned in, their eyes wide, some holding tools awkwardly, others just watching. He showed them slowly, carefully, not just fixing the bike, but explaining why each piece mattered, how every bolt carried its own weight. "Machines don't judge you," he said, his voice calm, steady. "They either work or they don't. And if they don't, you fix them, step by step." The children nodded, and one boy tried mimicking the motion. The wrench slipped and clanged to the floor. Daniel crouched beside him, picked it up, and placed it back in his hand. "Try again. Mistakes aren't the end. They're instructions." The boy smiled shyly and adjusted his grip. In the corner, Sophie knelt beside another child, her small hands guiding his through tightening a screw on a skateboard. She laughed when a streak of grease smeared across her cheek, her joy filling the space more than any polished speech could. She moved like she belonged here, and Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. Eleanor watched from the doorway, leaning lightly against the frame. The sharpness she usually carried in her shoulders was gone, replaced by something gentler. Her heart felt unexpectedly light as she took in the scene, the sound of children discovering they could build something with their own hands, Sophie's laughter mingling with it, Daniel's quiet patience anchoring the room. This wasn't charity. It was purpose. She thought of the boardroom she'd left behind, the numbers she'd once measured her worth against. None of it felt as alive as this moment. Here was a man who had been labeled disposable, standing taller than he ever had, showing children who had been told they had nothing that they could make something. Daniel wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a dark streak across his temple. He turned instinctively toward the doorway and found her watching, their eyes locked. For a beat, the noise of the room fell away. He didn't smile, not fully, but his mouth curved just enough, his expression softening in acknowledgement. He gave a small nod. Eleanor returned it, her chest warming at the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Not gratitude, not obligation, but recognition. She hadn't saved him, and he hadn't bowed to her. This wasn't about debts or rescues, it was about trust, the fragile kind that comes only when both people have walked through fire and decided not to run from the scars. Sophie caught sight of them and waved, grease-streaked and grinning. Daniel looked at his daughter, then back at Eleanor, his gaze steady, grounded. She felt the weight of it, a wordless promise that whatever they built here would last. Not because it was polished, but because it was real. She stepped back from the doorway, leaving them to the work. Her heels clicked softly against the hallway floor, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. She realized as she walked away that this was how foundations were truly laid, not with contracts and signatures, but with laughter, with grease, with trust exchanged in silence. And in that community center, with Sophie's laughter echoing behind her, Eleanor knew they weren't just repairing bikes. They were repairing lives, piece by piece, until even the broken parts fit together again. The school auditorium smelled faintly of fresh varnish and flowers, as if the building itself had tried to prepare for the occasion. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, not with whispers this time, but with a low hum of excitement. Parents chatted warmly, neighbors leaned in to greet each other, children fidgeted in their seats. It was the same hall, the same stage, but it didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt expectant, alive. Daniel sat in the front row, his posture upright, but his hands folded loosely in his lap. The suit he wore was borrowed again, but this time he wore it differently, less like armor, more like acknowledgement. Beside him, Eleanor sat quietly, her usual edge softened, her presence not as an executive or benefactor, but as something simpler, steadier. Together they waited as Sophie walked onto the stage. The hall erupted in applause before she had even lifted her bow. She paused, blinking at the sound, her cheeks pink, her small chest rising and falling as she absorbed it. A year ago she had walked onto this stage trembling, her notes fragile and uneven, her courage hidden behind tears. Tonight she stood taller, bow poised, her violin gleaming under the lights. Daniel's breath caught. He had seen her practice this piece at home, heard it rise from her room late at night when she thought he was asleep. But seeing her here, in this hall that had once witnessed their lowest moment, felt like redemption, written in music. Sophie closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and began. The first note rang out, bold and clear, echoing through the rafters with a confidence that silenced even the children in the back row. Her bow danced across the strings, no longer hesitant but sure, weaving a melody that pulsed with joy and defiance. The sound filled every corner of the hall, sweeping away the memory of chains, of gasps, of shame. Daniel's eyes burned as he watched her. Every measure was a declaration. She wasn't afraid anymore. The music carried pieces of him too, the man who had almost given up, who had sat in a holding cell, believing his daughter deserved better than him. Yet here she was, proving he was enough, proving they both were. Eleanor glanced sideways at Daniel, seeing the tears he tried not to blink away, the way his lips pressed together as if holding back more than he could say. She reached out, resting her hand gently on his arm. He didn't flinch. He didn't hide. He just nodded slightly. The connection unspoken but understood. The music swelled, Sophie's bow cutting the air with bold, fearless strokes. She leaned into the instrument, her whole body moving with the rhythm, every note carrying weight and freedom at once. When the final chord rang out, it hung in the air for a long, shimmering second before fading. Silence filled the hall, perfect, reverent, then broke into an ovation that shook the rafters. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, their applause louder than the whispers had ever been. Daniel rose too, though his eyes stayed on Sophie as she bowed, cheeks flushed, her smile bright and unguarded. She looked straight at him as she stepped off the stage, her violin tucked under her arm. He bent down as she reached him, his arms opening wide. She leaned into him without hesitation, the sound of applause wrapping around them like a tide. He whispered into her hair, his voice thick but steady. "You did it, Soph." She pulled back just enough to smile at him, her eyes shining. "We did it, Dad." Eleanor's hand remained on his arm, steady and sure. For the first time, none of them felt like they were standing in the shadow of the past. This wasn't an ending, or a rescue, or a performance to prove worth. It was something new. The story didn't end here, but for the first time, it felt like a beginning. If this story moved you even a little, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which part of Daniel and Sophie's journey stayed with you most. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because more stories of hope, resilience, and second chances are on the way.